Assalamu alaikum. This is Yusuf Ismail, phone on behalf of the IPCI. And today we'll look at an allegation that has been circulating within missionary circles, particularly amongst polemicists, that Islam allegedly allows the rape of female captives. And nothing could be further from the truth. You find in the Quran in Surah 4 verse 25 the exhortation given that you are to marry those who are under some sort of captivity, those who you would deem the Oma Malakat Aymanuhum, those who what your right hands possess. And we're going to unpack and look at some of the allegations that has been circulating within missionary circles. And of course, attempt to unpack whether missionaries, polemicists, and Christian fundamentalists can in fact hold the same level of critique against Islam and the same level of consistency if, for example, they have something similar within the ambit of their faith. Now, here's the allegation. The allegation is, as has been seen by some of the notorious Islamophobes, and when I say Islamophobes, I don't mean they necessarily hate Muslims, but certainly antagonistic towards Islam, antagonistic towards anything the Quran. You've got psychopaths now resorting to eating on the Quran, urinating on the Quran, tearing up the Quran, immature behavior. And these are the sort of individuals that are at the forefront. Not that they are scholarly in any way, but more particularly that they've got a high amount of viewership on YouTube, on social media, and therefore their particular message reaches a far larger audience. So here's the point. The allegation is that Islam, in fact, permits Muslim men, allegedly, to rape and have sexual intercourse with their slave girls by any means possible. Now, at the outset, we need to argue and point this out that this is essentially absurd because the right to have sex with a woman, if at all, does not necessarily imply, from the Islamic point of view, that one has the right to rape her. There's absolutely no evidence from that in the Quran. It's totally baseless, and you'd find a condemnation of this within the fiqh literature. But let's unpack this. Let's look at some of the classical material that you find on this particular issue. The fact pointing out that rape in Islam, in a general sense, is completely forbidden. I'll give you a passage from Imam Malik's Al-Muwatta, volume 2, page 734, depending, of course, on the version and the translation that you have. Imam Malik goes on to say, whoever rapes a woman, if she is a slave, then the punishment is to be carried out on the rapist. And there is no punishment for the woman who has been raped, whatever the case. If we look at Imam Shafi, another jurist, in his Kitab al volume 3, page 253, he says that if a man acquires by force a slave girl, and this is obviously at a time and a history when slavery was indeed the norm in society in general. Today, of course, nobody's going to call for slavery or the institutionalization of slavery, and the Quran, in a broad sense, in terms of the mode of revelation, and of course in terms of the revealed verses, has a trajectory leading up to the eventual and total elimination of slavery. So nobody's calling for slavery to exist today. Slavery is totally outlawed. It should be outlawed. The Quran is vehemently opposed to slavery, at least within the context of the 21st century. We would apply the ethics and the prophetic paradigm. It would be totally unacceptable. But at the time when slavery was, in fact, the norm in society, this is what Imam Shafi says. If a man acquires by force a slave girl, then has sexual intercourse with her after he acquires her by force, he will receive the punishment for illegal sexual intercourse. You go on in Sahih Muslim. This is one of now the authentic, amongst the Siyah the 6 authentic traditions that you have, Sahih Bukhari, Muslim, Sunan Abu Dawud, and so on. But this is what you've got in Sahih Muslim, book number 15, hadith number 4082. That Hilal bin Yasaf reported that a person got angry and slapped his slave girl. Thereupon, Suwaid bin Muqarrin said to him, "See, I was one of the 7 sons of Muqarrin, and we had but one slave girl. The youngest of us slapped her. And what happened? Allah's messenger commanded us to set her free." Now here you have a situation where in the hadith literature you had a family, group of individuals that owned a slave girl, and she was assaulted. How? By being slapped. What was the response to that? The Prophet, peace be upon him, dictated that she be freed. Now, if that is the case, if you are to free a slave girl based on the fact of a single slap, does it make sense that this religion is going to command the rape of slave girls? Does it make sense? Absolutely not. It's ludicrous. So, the point is that those who attack Islam on this particular premise cannot obviously defend the biblical narrative and, of course, their own particular worldview, and cannot sustain the argument. Why I say this is that the Prophet, peace be upon him, has prohibited causing of harm and oppressing those under authority, under some sort of servitude, under some sort of bondage. Rape, by its definition and by its extension, is de facto causing harm to a particular person, is an act of violence, is an act of forced sexual aggression. Now, if any critic for that particular matter says that Islam made an exception to the general prohibition in terms of which it allowed one to rape one slave girl, God forbid, then the general point is that the burden of proof, the onus, rests on the individual making the alleged claim. And so far, we've got absolutely nothing to indicate or show or illustrate, were that necessary, that this is in fact allowed in any given sense. Nothing whatsoever. So I've given you the juristic position on this specific issue where there is prohibition. The Quranic point of view certainly does not allow any form of rape. Assault, even a simple slap, necessitates you freeing the slave girl. How could you come to the conclusion that slavery is in fact permitted in the context of the 21st century and that rape of slave women are in fact allowed? And we're going to explore this further, more particularly when we tie this up with the fact that the same missionaries, those very same missionaries who make the argument on this particular point, do not have a moral worldview or a moral upper ground in terms of which they could level any basis of critique against Islamic worldview, based on the fact and based on the premise that within the biblical narrative you have a situation where not only is slavery and sanguinary warfare allowed, but you have, God forbid, rape. Let me give you an example here. I'm going to give you a quotation from a particular book called The Fruit of Her Hands, A Psychology of Biblical Women, by Matthew B. Schwartz and co-authored with Kalman J. Kaplan. And this is what they say in relation to the book of Deuteronomy. This is one of the 5 books of the Pentateuch allegedly written by Moses, but no evidence that it was in fact written by Moses, because the end of the book of Deuteronomy, as we have discussed on previous occasions, clearly indicate that Moses could not have been the author. He could not have authored his death. He could not have authored that he had died at 120 years old, and so on and so forth. This is what they say on page 146 to 147. The book of Deuteronomy prescribes its own rules for the treatment of women captured in war. Captured in war. Women have always followed armies to do the soldiers' laundry, to nurse the sick and wounded, and to serve as prostitutes. Imagine that. They would often dress in such a way as to attract the soldiers who won the battle. The Bible recognizes the realities of the battle situation in its rules on how to treat female captives and take them as concubines or sex slaves. Now there we go there. Within the biblical context, you have a situation that women and captives of war are not married but kept as concubines, which is certainly a recognized institution in the Bible, and indeed as sex slaves. Now I want to bring for your attention something which is commonly quoted but not often explained or expounded, and that is in the book of Numbers chapter 31 verse 17. Numbers 31:17 is as follows. I'm going to read from the paraphrased Good News Bible. Why sometimes choose this? For easy readability. It's not elegant like the King James or the English Standard Version. It's not literal like the New American Standard Bible. It's not necessarily as scholarly as the Revised Standard Version or some of the more scholarly works, the Oxford Annotated Bible, but it's a paraphrase. Good reading. Good News Bible. If you want to understand it, you have difficulty to basically get through the Bible from cover to cover, and it can be a bore. You can read some of these passages and you can go to sleep. You can literally go to sleep reading these passages. Get yourself a Good News Bible, and you'd be able to read it simplistically. It's easy to understand. So here's the point. Numbers 31 verse 17 reads as follows. So now, kill every boy, and kill every woman who has had sexual intercourse. But keep alive for yourselves all the girls and all the women who are virgins. Now all of you have killed anyone who have touched a corpse must stay outside the camp for 7 days. I don't know why you should stay outside the camp for 7 days, maybe some sort of purification. What's the context behind this? Kill all the boys, kill all the girls who have had sex with a man, but keep alive, and as many translators have pointed out, all the young girls who have not had sex with a man for yourself. Now the background behind this was that there was a holy war triggered against the Midianites. And that starts from the beginning of chapter 31. God Almighty, allegedly, Yahweh, if this is God revealing to Moses, commands Moses to go out and slaughter the Midianites, punish the Midianites for what they did to the children of Israel, to the people of Israel. And after you have done that, you will die. So Moses said to the people, and this is a commandment, chapter 31, verse 3, get ready for war so that you can attack Midian and punish them for what they did to the Lord. From each tribe of Israel send 1,000 men to war. So 1,000 men were chosen for each tribe, a total of 12,000 men ready for battle. Moses sent to war under the command of Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the priest, who took charge of the sacred objects and the trumpets for giving signals. They attacked Midian as the Lord had commanded Moses, and killed all the men, including the 5 kings of Midian: Evi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, and Reba. They also killed Balaam, son of Beor. And the people of Israel captured the Midianite women and children. They captured the women and children. They took their cattle and flocks, plundered all their wealth, and burnt all their cities and camps. It's like an ancient day ISIS in action. They took all the loot that they had captured, including the prisoners and the animals, and brought them to Moses and Eleazar and to the community of the people of Israel, who were at the camps on the plains of Moab across the Jordan from Jericho. And then in verse 13, once they returned, all the other leaders of the community went out of the camp to meet the army. And we are told that in verse 14 that Moses was angry. He was angry. Why was he angry? Why was Moses angry with his army captains, his battalions, his officers, the companies that returned? Why was he angry? He was angry because according to him, they had allegedly kept the women alive. They had kept the women alive. So he then goes and gives the commandments: kill every boy, and kill every woman. This is the Good News Bible. Again, it says woman, but in actual fact, young girl, and I'll explain why young girl, who has had sexual intercourse, but keep alive for yourself all the girls and all the women who are virgins. Now, what is the background and the context before this? If you look at Numbers 31, verse 17, if you read Numbers 31, if we engage in a detailed historical examination of Numbers 31:17, Numbers 31:18, the details are that you've got these female captives that are caught, and they are distributed to Moses' men for distributing for many reasons, as you read closer in the verse. And what you find in Numbers 31, verse 18, is that although many translations, like the Good News Bible, like the King James Version, like the not the King James Version, but the NIV and some of the more modern paraphrased Bible, like the Living Bible and so on, translated as women, in actual fact, looking closely at the verse, there is a reference to children. The Hebrew text, the Hebrew word there, and you look at the Masoretic text on your screen, underlined in red on the Masoretic text, the Hebrew word is tough. Tough is children. If you look at the Hebrew lexicon, by Professor Selig Newman. Tough, translated as child or infant. You look at the Complete Hebrew English Pocket Dictionary to the Old Testament by Carl Feyerabend, published in 1905. This is how he translates tough from Numbers 31:18. Tough, children, little ones. Complete Hebrew English Pocket Dictionary to the Old Testament. If you look at a compendious Hebrew lexicon by Samuel Pike, the word tough, little ones or children, mincing in a childish manner, as in Isaiah, to drop, to distill, to prophesy, to distill instruction. And we'll give you three accurate translations. I'll give you the example of the Jubilee Bible, 2000, Numbers 31:18. All the female children that have not known a man, all the female children that have not known a man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. The Webster's Bible translation, all the female children that have not known a man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. The Living Bible, that's only the little girls may live. You may keep them for yourselves. Little girls, tough little girls, women, children, female children. So we are talking about captives of war, and the female children are to be kept alive. For what? Why is it that the boys were killed? Even if they're children, why were the boys killed? And why were the female children kept alive? And why were the slightly older women killed, massacred, murdered, slaughtered? What was the rationale behind that? What is the significance behind that in Numbers 31:17-18? It says there, keep alive for yourselves. Now, here's the point. What's the word for yourselves in the Hebrew language? What's the word? The word is lachem. When you read the verse, it does not give us much information in terms of what is basically meant. But again, look at the Masoretic text. Underline Numbers 31:18. In red again in the Masoretic text, the word for yourselves in Hebrew is lachem or lacham. Lacham. What does that mean? What does lacham or lachem mean? Well, I'll give you a translation. If you look at the Complete Hebrew and English Critical and Pronouncing Dictionary by Professor William Roy, lachem means the bread, flesh, devoured, partook of, participated, accepted, received, consumed, devoured. How do you consume? Devoured. They weren't going to physically eat them. Anything with which we are pleased or satisfied. To devour as flesh. That's a Complete Hebrew English Critical Dictionary. Hebrew English Lexicon, eat, devour, wage war. Eat, devour, wage war. A Complete Hebrew English Pocket Dictionary to the Old Testament, by which we looked at earlier. Lachem, to compress, to fight, to eat, to consume. A manual Hebrew and English lexicon, eat, consume. Hebrew and English lexicon without points, to join, to lay, engage together, to be engaged. If you look at the exposition of the prophet Ezekiel, with useful exposition thereupon by Reverend William Greenhill, this is dated to 1581. Lachem, eat up their estates. So, lachem basically is a proposition. When you read from the lexicons and the commentary in the Hebrew, lachem means to eat, engage, devour. It obviously doesn't mean that the Israelites were going to physically eat, physically engage, and physically devour, but it essentially means that this was to be used, they were going to be used in a sexual sense, in a sexual context. The voice translation of the Bible, that's been produced, an ancient interpretation of Numbers 31:18. It says, and as for the virgins, you can take them as you desire. Shea Cohen, who was a professor of Hebrew literature and philosophy in the Department of Near East and Middle Eastern Languages at Harvard University, he explained in his book, The Beginnings of Jewishness boundaries, varieties, and uncertainties. In his discussion and explanation of Numbers 31, 17 and 18, he says the following: Moses enjoins upon the returning warriors to kill their Midianite female captives who have lain with a man, but spare for yourselves every young woman who has not had carnal relations with a man. We may be sure, this is what he says, we may be sure that for yourselves means that the warriors may use their virgin captives sexually. He's let the cat out of the bag. So the implication behind Numbers 31, 17 to 18 is clear, is evident, is apparent, and nobody can deny the background to that. He continues in his footnote 52 of his same book, The Beginnings of Jewishness, Boundaries, Varieties, Uncertainties, published by the University of California. He says, I do not know why the New Jewish Version omits for yourselves. The Hebrew word lachem is unambiguous. There's no ambiguity there. That the intent of for yourselves is sexual is obvious. The passage is correctly understood by Rabbi Simeon Yochai, and he makes reference to an ancient rabbi who understood this in this particular context. But let's not stop there. Let's look at the Talmud of the land of Israel, also known as the Palestinian Talmud, by Simeon. How do rabbis interpret keep alive for yourselves? To them it says that they should keep them alive for themselves as slave boys and slave girls. But the boys were to be kept. The boys were to be kept alive. Or were they to be killed? The boys were to be killed. The boys were to be killed. Why were the boys to be killed and only the girls kept alive? In the Jerusalem Talmud, you read, you shall let live as slaves and slave girls for yourselves. In the Talmud, Mas Kiddushin, it's an online source that you can obviously obtain. We're told, keep them alive for yourselves as bond women. Bond women. What does that mean? Not to marry them, you keep them alive as bond women. Number one, marriage with these children could take place, which would mean child marriage. Who would give the consent? Because they're children. That's rape. Or in certain instances, if marriage doesn't take place, the children could be simply used sexually for the own gratification of the Israelites. Now, if this is not mass slaughter, if this is not mass killing, if this is not mass rape, and you seek to justify this under the dictates allegedly of Yahweh giving this perverse law to Moses, then what moral authority do you have to have the audacity to criticize the Quran? What's the basis? What's the basis beyond that? What's the basis? And I mean, we can go through different, we'll look at the historian, for example, Flavius Josephus. If you look at the antiquities, the works of Flavius Josephus, comprising the antiquities of the Jews, the history of Jewish wars, and the life of Flavius Josephus, written by himself, translated from the original Greek. This is what he says, and he's writing in about 100 AD, confirming the account, the Hebrew war with the Midianites and overcoming them, referring to Numbers 31. He says, now when the enemies were discomfited, the Hebrews spoiled their country and took a great prey, and destroyed the men that were its inhabitants, together with the women who only they left the virgins alone, as Moses had commanded Phinehas to do, who indeed came back, bringing with him an army that had received no harm and a great deal of prey, 52,000 beeves, 75,600 sheep, 6,000 donkeys, with an immense quantity of gold and silver furniture. He goes on. He says, there were also led captive about 32,000 virgins. So Moses parted the prey. 32,000 virgins, of which 30 and 2 were for the Lord. Now what would the Lord do with 32 virgins? What would they do? Unless they will be dedicated for the temple priests as temple prostitutes. So can you see, you've got the institution of temple prostitution, allegedly, or happening during the time of Moses, and the priests and the rabbis, temple priests, because you're dedicating them to the Lord. What would the Lord do with raped and ravaged virgins? And also, more importantly, how does one determine whether a woman is a virgin or not? How? How do you make that determination? Well, if they're young girls, you obviously know that they're possibly virgins. A bit slightly older, because marriage took place very young back in those days. And what's quite clear from this verse is that tough infants, children, could be married off. So child marriage is allowed in the Old Testament. Child marriage is institutionalized, as you can clearly see in the Pentateuch. And if they're not married, they're kept as concubines or as sex slaves. So here's the problem. Here's a problem. I mean, we can go on and on, but if you look at different, it's a theological Bible commentary. You've got, for example, you've got the commentary of the Holy Scriptures by John Peter Lang. You've got a whole array of material, that basically is occurring, that it leads you only to this conclusion that if you look at the book of Numbers 31, verse 17 to 18, the Israelite warriors, kept all the female children for themselves. And the Hebrew lexicons, all of them, the dictionaries, the translations, all render yourself to be understood in a sexual context. And the ancient scholars further interpreted the verse to mean that the Israelites, that's Moses' soldiers, were to keep the female children for themselves. They were to be used sexually. And the text itself, there's no indication in the text to indicate that they were to lean towards marriage or that marriage took place. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. So the point is that you do not have to look at history anachronistically, because what happened here is 1,000 years ago. But then the point is, if that is indeed the case, why do you criticize Islam? Why do you accuse Islam of engaging when no such rape, nothing? You don't have anything comparatively, remotely close to this in the Quran. Nothing, absolutely nothing. So when the Quran says, "Oma malakat aymanuhum," in most instances it contemplates marriage with them, as in Surah 4 verse 25. You cannot take them as love companions, secret love companions. What you have here is clear abuse. The question is, to all the critics out there, is this. Number one, why were no boys saved alive? Were there no virgins amongst the boys? Number two, who in their right mind would marry an Israelite after having seen their family slaughtered, if critics generally suggest that marriage in fact took place, referring to other biblical verses? Who in their right minds would do that? There's no evidence in the text itself that marriage took place. Absolutely none. But the girls were taken as sex slaves. And what was happening to them? Lachem, for yourselves, to be used in a sexual sense, to consume, to devour. Obviously they were not going to be eaten alive. How were they going to be devoured? How were they going to be consumed? And why were only fresh virgins taken? And the girls obviously were prepubescent. They were underage. So rape of young girls took place in accordance with the dictates of Yahweh, in a command given to Moses, conveyed to the Israelites, as articulated in Numbers 31 verse 17 to 18. You cannot get away from this. And the question I'd like to ask the Islamophobes, the missionaries, the polemicists out there, think, if your mother, your daughter, or your sister was a Midianite living in the time of Moses, would you have taken them or allowed to be taken by the Israelites? That's a question we need to ask. And so what you find in this grotesquely disturbing passage, distasteful passage, is not just simply a genocide that took place in an early period of history, not only sanguinary warfare and massacre, but innocent girls, tough, young children, women children, were sexually violated by the Israelites under the command of Moses, as allegedly inspired by Yahweh. And that obviously takes us to the greater question, is that could these passages have indeed been inspired by Yahweh? Could they have come from God? And penultimately, is the book of Numbers a book indeed written by Moses, and an accurate reflection in terms of what is contained in the book of Numbers? We find nothing close to this in the Quran or anything in Islamic literature. So we're going to focus on this and other issues when we deal with the book of Numbers in more detail in our future sessions. But for the time being, I think the implications behind this rather disturbing passage are exceptionally concerning, worrying, more particularly when it comes from the polemicists and the critics of Islam who always poke holes against the Islamic narrative but have absolutely nothing to say when it comes against their own particular faith. As the Bible says, and as Jesus himself would say, judge not that you be not judged, for with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged, and what measure ye mete, it shall be measured unto you. You hypocrite, why do you look at the beam in your brother's eye, or why do you look at the mote in your brother's eye and not see the beam in your own eye? First remove what is in your own eye, and then you can essentially critique the other side. So that's our discussion for this session. Have a look at the references, have a look at the lexicons, have a look at the text of the Bible, look at some of the material that we've shared with you. Share, study, and discuss with your Christian friends and neighbors. And until next time, this is Yusuf Ismail, phone on behalf of the IPCI. Assalamu alaikum and greetings of peace. Allahu ya Allahu ya
الرشيد الشهيد اللطيف الخبير